I struck boldly and not as the papers say. I walked with a firm step through 1,000 of his friends, was stopped, but pushed on. A colonel was at his side. I shouted, "Sic semper," before I fired, and I can never repent it, though we hated to kill. Our country owed all her troubles to him, and God simply made me the instrument of his punishment.
On April 14, 1865, the same night that he'd murdered President Abraham Lincoln, an actor named John Wilkes Booth wrote the preceding passage in the margins of his appointment book, which he was using as a diary.
Most people are familiar with the broad strokes of Lincoln's assassination in Ford's Theater. However, the details surrounding Booth's motivation, including the question of whether he was working alone or under government orders, remain murky to this day. During the Civil War, Booth led a double life as an actor and as an agent for the Confederate Secret Service.
Booth's work as a Secret Service agent meant that he operated under the orders of the Confederate President, Jefferson Davis. Additionally, he was personally acquainted with Lincoln's Vice President, Andrew Johnson.
Johnson benefited from Lincoln's death, becoming President of the United States. And in the immediate aftermath of Lincoln's shooting, the Secretary of State, Edwin Stanton, acted outside the bounds of his office in what may have been an attempted coup. Each of these three, Davis, Johnson, and Stanton, had motive to collaborate with Booth to have Lincoln killed.
Conspiracy? Maybe. Coincidence? Maybe. Complicated?
Absolutely.
Conspiracy theories about Lincoln's assassination have a long history, dating back to the immediate aftermath of Lincoln's death. This kind of speculation isn't unusual, especially when it comes to the death of a United States president. Only 4 presidents have been successfully assassinated in U.S. history, and none of those assassinations was free of speculation in the immediate aftermath.
These sorts of theories are so common, in fact, that an entire appendix of the Warren Commission, an investigation into the death of another president, John F. Kennedy, details the theories that tend to crop up around presidential assassination attempts.
Generally, in the immediate aftermath of any assassination or attempted assassination, newspapers publish misinformation or outright speculation. Later, when the federal government releases a different official story, conspiracy theorists can point to the discrepancies between news reports and official statements as evidence of a conspiracy. The now standard practice of fact-checking didn't become common among news organizations until the 1920s, meaning President John F. Kennedy was the only U.S. president to be assassinated in an era of journalistic fact-checking.
On February 15, 1933, an anti-capitalist activist named Giuseppe Zangara tried and failed to shoot President Franklin Roosevelt at a rally. Conspiracy theorists and newspapers tried to link Zangara to the Chicago Mafia, in spite of a lack of evidence connecting them.
The pattern continued after an attempt on President Truman's life in November 1950, when many speculated but failed to prove that his pair of attempted assassins worked under the orders of the Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico. The assassins were members of the party, but officially they acted alone to raise awareness and sympathy for Puerto Rico's independence movement.
And, of course, John F. Kennedy's assassination in 1963 remains a touchstone for conspiracy theorists. Today, theorists have tried to tie Kennedy's assassin Lee Harvey Oswald to Soviet Russia, the Mafia, and the CIA. The official story is that Oswald acted alone.
It makes sense that people would struggle to accept that someone as powerful as the President of the United States would die of something as mundane as a gunshot wound from an independent assassin. Especially in the case of Lincoln, the first president to ever be assassinated while in office. Booth's successful plot was unprecedented.
But just because presidential assassination conspiracy theories are common, doesn't mean some of them aren't true.
Today, Abraham Lincoln is revered, widely regarded as the greatest United States president. But when he lived, he wasn't just unpopular. The public loathed him. He won his first term with less than 40% of the popular vote, giving him the lowest presidential victory in United States history. This was possible because 4 candidates appeared on the 1860 ballot.
Even Northerners disliked Lincoln, feeling he'd gone too far with the Emancipation Proclamation, and Southerners used Lincoln's unpopularity to drum up support for their secessionist cause, promising their potential allies freedom from Lincoln's rule.
Any politician in Lincoln's era would have struggled to appeal to a large voter base. Besides the North-South divide that led to the Civil War, the Democratic and Republican parties also fractured as the pro-slavery Democrats split into subgroups who supported or opposed secession, and the Republican Party expanded its platform to try to appeal to aisle-crossing Democrats.
Even among Lincoln's fellow Republicans who shared his beliefs, he was seen as coarse and ignorant. Lincoln was born poor and lacked a formal education, which led many to see him as provincial and unprepared for the challenges of the presidency. When the South seceded early in Lincoln's first term, many placed the blame directly at his feet.
When Lincoln was up for re-election in 1864, he knew he would have to change his campaign strategy, and he found a chance at re-election in his running mate, Andrew Johnson.
Johnson only served as vice president during Lincoln's second term. For the first term, Lincoln served with Senator Hannibal Hamlin, but with shaky chances of re-election in 1864, Lincoln opted for a non-traditional choice for his running mate.
Lincoln was an anti-slavery Republican. Johnson was a Democrat, a former slave owner, and a senator from Tennessee, a Confederate state. While Johnson and Lincoln both believed in a unified United States and opposed the Southern secession, they disagreed on almost every other major issue.
But why would two politicians who are so different from one another run on the same ticket? Well, it all comes down to politics.
Traditional party lines broke down during the Civil War. The Democratic Party fractured between those who supported secession, known as Copperheads, and the War Democrats, who adhered to the Confederacy's ideals while opposing secession. Many War Democrats voted Republican in 1864.
These party-crossing War Democrats were such a large voting bloc, the Republican Party temporarily renamed itself the National Union Party to appear more inclusive to voters who would ordinarily never vote Republican.
The National Union Party represented pro-slavery and anti-slavery voters, people who directly benefited from the Southern plantation economy, and those who vehemently opposed it. Lincoln needed to appeal to a broad base with often contradictory viewpoints.
So it makes sense that Lincoln would choose a running mate who was basically the opposite of himself. While Lincoln's progressive views would appeal to traditional Republican voters, Johnson's Southern roots and pro-slavery leanings would bring in the War Democrat voters.
This proved true during the 1864 Republican National Convention, when Johnson won more delegates than the incumbent Hamlin during the first rounds of voting. We don't know exactly when Lincoln decided to replace Hamlin on the ticket, but according to reports, Hamlin believed he would be nominated until Lincoln picked Andrew Johnson at the convention.
This arrangement benefited Johnson as well. As a senator, he'd already gained some influence over Lincoln. Most notably, he campaigned and succeeded in exempting Tennessee from the Emancipation Proclamation.
The Emancipation Proclamation, which ended legal slavery in the United States, was issued January 1, 1863. Slavery wouldn't become illegal in Tennessee until over 2 years later, in February 1865. If Johnson was able to accomplish this much as a senator, his influence as vice president would have been incredible.
Not to mention that it conveniently positioned him as the next in the chain of succession when Lincoln died in office.
Besides their political disagreements, Lincoln and Johnson developed a personal animosity soon after their term began. On Lincoln's inauguration day, Johnson overindulged and was publicly drunk. In Lincoln's opinion, Johnson hadn't only embarrassed himself, but also the presidency as a whole.
During the 4 months they served together, Johnson and Lincoln's relationship cooled. By some reports, the two barely spoke to one another. Instead of increasing his influence, Johnson found himself ignored as vice president. Only Lincoln's death would vault Johnson into a position of power and prominence.
Lincoln's unpopular presidency was marked by a series of assassination threats. Previous attempts on Lincoln's life included poisoned desserts delivered by mail from unknown and never identified sources, as well as a misguided attempt at germ warfare from a physician named Blackburn.
Blackburn treated patients infected with yellow fever and planned to send Lincoln clothes worn by his patients in an attempt to infect the president. However, Blackburn's co-conspirator determined the plot to be too risky and never delivered the shirts to the White House.
Even if Lincoln had received the clothes, he couldn't have contracted yellow fever from the shirts, as this disease was spread via mosquito bite.
In spite of the numerous attempts on Lincoln's life, his only source of personal protection was through private security guards.
Today, presidents, their families, and other high-ranking government officials are protected by the Secret Service. The Secret Service was formed the same year Lincoln was assassinated, 1865, but the group's original purpose was to investigate counterfeiting and fiscal crimes.
The possibility of dying early in office seemed to weigh heavily on Lincoln. President Lincoln may even have prophesied his own death. A little more than a week before his assassination, Lincoln told his former law partner, Ward Hill Layman, that he dreamed that the public gathered to mourn a sudden and unexpected presidential death.
Layman never mentioned this supposed prophetic dream until decades after the assassination. And as this conversation took place privately between the two men, no one else has been able to confirm that Lincoln ever claimed to have foreseen his death. This very well could have been exaggeration or a complete fiction on Layman's part.
Premonition or not, Lincoln had good reason to fear an attack at the time. His assassination came only 5 days after General Lee's surrender at the Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War. Passions were high on both sides of the North-South divide, and many in Lincoln's government had reason to vehemently disagree with his plans for Southern Reconstruction.
Lincoln's administration was often just as divided as the country. A blend of Democrats and Republicans, Northerners and Southerners, Lincoln's appointments had helped him get elected by appealing to a broad swath of voters. But now, the vastly differing viewpoints within his government meant that finding a consensus was even more difficult than in a traditional administration.
Some of Lincoln's officials, like his Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, saw slavery as a great evil and wanted to see the South punished for its treason. Others, like Vice President Andrew Johnson, who was from Tennessee, felt that the losses in the Civil War and the blow to the Southern economy the Emancipation Proclamation entailed were punishment enough. Johnson campaigned for a more benevolent form of Reconstruction.
These deep divisions and dangerous times led to one of the most unbelievable assassinations in history.
Lincoln invited General Ulysses S. Grant and Grant's wife Julia to join him and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, for a performance of a comedy called Our American Cousin.
Grant was a national hero after the end of the Civil War. Lincoln wouldn't see an upsurge in his own popularity until after his death. But the celebratory mood after the war's conclusion left many patriotic Americans eager to see the victorious president and general in a public appearance. Their attendance at the play was well publicized by the local papers, and they both anticipated a large crowd at the theater.
But the night of the play, General Grant and his wife canceled their plans. Today, we're not sure what spurred the Grants to skip the play, but it may have been due to Julia Grant and Mary Todd Lincoln's animosity toward one another. In lieu of the Grants, Mary Todd instead invited another military general, Henry Rathbone, and his fiancée, Clara Harris.
At the time, Lincoln's Secretary of State, Edwin Stanton, was responsible for ensuring Lincoln's safety. Stanton had provided Lincoln with several different bodyguards in the past, and the night of April 14th assigned one of Lincoln's usuals, John Parker.
Lincoln was unhappy with Parker's history of heavy drinking, and before visiting Ford's Theater, he requested that Stanton assign a different bodyguard, another of his regulars, Sergeant Thomas Eckert. Stanton refused because Eckert was unavailable that evening, or so Stanton claimed.
Still, Lincoln was in high spirits that day. The war was over, and he spent the evening socializing. According to reports, Lincoln didn't want to attend the theater that night, and when time came to leave for the show, he said, quote, "I suppose it's time to go, though I would rather stay," end quote.
The Grant's last-minute cancellation left Lincoln with an increased feeling of pressure to make the promised public appearance. He didn't want to disappoint the public any more than Grant's absence already would. Perhaps, if Grant had been present in Lincoln's box that evening, he could have prevented the assassination.
But first, let's look at John Wilkes Booth's history and the factors that led him to become the first man to kill a president of the United States. John Wilkes Booth was an actor and a Confederate sympathizer. Toward the end of the Civil War, he became a secret agent for the Confederate Secret Service, a network of spies with ties to the secessionist government and Confederate President Jefferson Davis.
Davis oversaw Secret Service activities and personally approved several missions, including Booth's, to win the war for the Confederacy by kidnapping Abraham Lincoln and holding him hostage.
To be clear, this is not a conspiracy theory, but a fact. Booth's work as a Confederate spy and his kidnapping plots against President Lincoln are well documented.
When General Grant took over the Union Army, he ended the previously standard practice of prisoner exchanges. This was a massive blow to the Confederate Army, which lacked the numbers of the Northerners, and many in Confederate leadership felt they couldn't spare a single captured soldier.
Confederate leaders believed that the Union Army and United States government would be willing to negotiate for their president's safe return should the Confederacy capture Lincoln. Davis assigned 3 separate secret agents to each attempt to kidnap Lincoln. One of those agents was Booth.
While we don't know exactly when Booth became a secret agent, we know that in the summer of 1864, he'd almost entirely stopped acting in order to focus solely on his efforts for the Confederate cause.
Booth was responsible for recruiting his own co-conspirators in the kidnapping plot. His earliest recruits included close friends and acquaintances.
In December 1864, Booth recruited George Atzerodt, a man with demonstrated proficiency in navigating the Potomac River. His navigation skills would be necessary to transport the kidnapped Lincoln from Union territory into Virginia.
Another key member of Booth's conspiracy was David Harold, a hunter who could serve as a guide through the rural countryside.
Booth's last recruitment was Lewis Thornton Powell, a strong and healthy man who would be up to the task of wrestling and subduing a struggling President Lincoln.
Booth ultimately had 7 co-conspirators who met regularly in a tavern owned by Mary Surratt and operated by her oldest son, John Surratt. Booth's orders were to kidnap Abraham Lincoln, transport him into Confederate-held lands, and hold him hostage for ransom. The specifics, such as when and where to capture Lincoln and who would assist Booth in this kidnapping, were left to Booth's discretion.
On March 17, 1865, just a month before the assassination, Booth and his co-conspirators learned that Lincoln planned to attend a play at the Campbell Military Hospital. Lincoln would travel with only his driver, leaving him exposed and unprotected while on the roads outside Washington, D.C.
Booth's plan was simple. After the play concluded, Booth and his conspirators would intercept the president's carriage on its way back to the White House, overpower Lincoln and his driver, and then spirit them both away through southern Maryland and into Confederate states.
On the night of the kidnapping attempt, one key part of the plan failed to materialize. Abraham Lincoln himself. He'd changed his plans at the last minute, choosing to attend a ceremony at the National Hotel instead.
Another kidnapping plot involved the Ford's Theater, the same location where Booth would ultimately kill Lincoln. At one point, Booth and his conspirators explored lowering Lincoln from his private box onto the stage during a performance, but they ultimately deemed this plan too complicated and unrealistic.
On April 9, 1865, General Lee of the Confederate Army surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse. With the war over, Booth and his conspirators lost all incentive to kidnap Lincoln. It was around this time that John Wilkes Booth made a new plan, and a conspiracy to kidnap became a conspiracy to murder.
Officially, Booth wanted revenge on the man who had defeated the Confederacy. Booth famously hated Lincoln even before the war, but had believed that the South would triumph.
Given a few lines from his diary, such as on April 14th when he wrote, quote, "Our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done," end quote, Booth may have also believed that Lincoln's death would inspire discouraged Confederate troops to resume fighting.
That interpretation is just speculation, but the theory that Booth wanted vengeance is widely accepted.
In addition to targeting Lincoln, Booth also plotted to assassinate two other key members of the Union government, Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William H. Seward.
All three attacks would occur on the same night, executed before the Secretary of War Edwin Stanton or any other member of the government would know what was happening or stop the plot. While Booth would target Lincoln, two other conspirators would be tasked with the deaths of Johnson and Seward.
On April 14th, shortly after 9:30 p.m., Booth arrived at the back door to Ford's Theater. His friend Edmund Spangler was working backstage during that night's performance, and Booth asked him to watch his horse while he went inside.
Lincoln's box was only accessible from the lobby, but Booth's planned escape route required him to have his horse ready and waiting at a backstage door. To reach the lobby, he had to exit the theater without Spangler noticing and re-enter through the front door, all without drawing attention or interrupting the performance.
Booth had performed in Ford's Theater many times before and was familiar with the theater's layout. Although it took him nearly a half hour, Booth navigated a path through a trapdoor, under the stage, out a side door, down an alley, and finally re-entered the theater through its front door shortly after 10 p.m.
His next step was to reach Lincoln, a task made easier by the fact that the president was unguarded.
Lincoln's bodyguard, Parker, the same bodyguard Lincoln had tried and failed to have replaced, had left his posting around intermission to visit a tavern across the street for a drink. Around 10:30 p.m., Booth entered Lincoln's box and barred the door behind himself to prevent anyone from reaching Lincoln to assist him.
Booth drew his gun and a Bowie knife, then waited. He was familiar with the play that night, a comedy called Our American Cousin. On a major laugh line, when the audience's laughter was loud enough to drown out the sound of a gunshot, he shot Abraham Lincoln in the head.
Lincoln's guest, Sergeant Rathbone, leapt into action and grappled with Booth. Ready with his knife, Booth stabbed Rathbone in the shoulder. Rathbone ultimately survived his injuries. The gunshot wound to the head didn't immediately kill Lincoln, but did leave him unconscious.
Booth leapt out of Lincoln's box onto the stage. It was his only means of escape with the door barricaded. As he fell from the box, Booth's leg became tangled in one of the flags draped over Lincoln's box. He landed poorly, breaking his fibula, a bone in the back of his leg.
Once on stage, Booth shouted "Sic semper tyrannis," which translates to "Thus always to tyrants," the Virginia state motto.
No longer concerned with secrecy, Booth ran directly from the stage to the back door, where his horse still waited. He mounted his horse and escaped the theater.
On April 14, 1865, just after 10:30 p.m., President Abraham Lincoln was shot but not instantly killed. John Wilkes Booth's plot to murder Lincoln was intricate, so much so that in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, few realized the crisis they just witnessed.
Mary Todd's screams alerted the other theater patrons that the violence was not part of the performance. Dr. Charles Leal was in the audience for the play and was the first to treat the president.
That night, Leal wrote, quote, "When I reached the president, he was in a state of general paralysis. His eyes were closed and he was in a profoundly comatose condition, while his breathing was intermittent and exceedingly stertorous."
2 other doctors arrived shortly, and the 3 agreed that the president's injuries were fatal. They decided that a theater box was not a dignified place for a president to die. Lincoln was too injured to make a return trip to the White House, so instead, he was moved to a house across the street and laid in bed.
5 more doctors arrived to treat the ailing president, including the Surgeon General Joseph Barnes and Lincoln's personal physician R.K. Stone. Lincoln remained unresponsive and in critical condition throughout the night.
Lincoln succumbed to his injuries at 7:22 the following morning.
Booth was successful in his plot to kill President Lincoln, but this was only one of 3 assassination plots he'd planned for that night. Now let's discuss what happened in the assassination attempts against Secretary of State William Seward and Vice President Andrew Johnson.
Lewis Powell, assigned to kill Seward, went to Seward's home at about 10 p.m. on April 14th, along with David Harold. Shortly before Booth shot Lincoln, Powell called on Seward.
William Seward had been in a carriage accident a few days prior and was now recovering in bed with constant medical attention.
Powell posed as a doctor, claiming that he'd arrived to deliver Seward's medication. Initially, Seward's servant, who answered the door, believed Powell, but he was under strict instructions to let no one inside the home. The servant offered to deliver the medication to Seward himself.
Powell forced his way past the servant and made his way inside while Harold remained outside. Booth originally recruited Harold because of Harold's familiarity with the rural swamplands outside of Washington, D.C., and tonight Harold planned to put his skills to use in guiding Powell out of the city and evading capture after his attack on Seward.
The scuffle between Powell and Seward's servant drew the attention of Seward's son, Assistant Secretary of State Frederick Seward. When Frederick confronted Powell, Powell attempted to shoot Frederick, but his gun didn't discharge.
Instead, Powell hit Frederick in the head with his gun. Another of Seward's sons, Augustus, approached Powell, and Powell stabbed him.
The sound of fighting and the screams of those Powell attacked spooked Harold, who abandoned his posting and fled.
Inside, Powell's next obstacle was George Robinson, Seward's bodyguard. Powell stabbed him and then entered Seward's room. There, he stabbed Seward's daughter and nurse, who were both present in the room, before finally stabbing the Secretary of State and fleeing. On his way out of Seward's home, he stabbed yet another of Seward's sons, as well as a State Department messenger.
Powell ultimately stabbed 5 people and left Frederick in a coma with a fractured skull after striking him in the head with his gun. Luckily, all of Powell's victims ultimately survived, including his target, William Seward.
George Atzerodt, the man recruited for his experience crossing the Potomac, was responsible for assassinating Vice President Andrew Johnson. Atzerodt was no cold-blooded murderer, and on the night of the planned assassination, he visited the Kirkwood House bar for some liquid courage.
Atzerodt spent the evening getting drunk. While at the bar, he asked the bartender, Michael Henry, about Johnson's whereabouts, but never followed up with any actual attempt on Johnson's life.
Instead, he spent the night drunkenly wandering throughout Washington, D.C., and fled the city the next day. He never spoke to John Wilkes Booth again.
In a confession after the assassination and Atzerodt's arrest, he would claim that he still believed that the plan for that night was to kidnap, not kill, Abraham Lincoln.
Maybe Booth decided to kill Lincoln on his own, without informing his co-conspirators. More likely, Atzerodt lied in his confession to downplay his own complicity. After all, he was aware of his own orders to kill Vice President Johnson, and most likely knew of Powell's attempt on Secretary of State Seward as well.
Of 3 plotted assassinations on the night of April 14th, only one was successful: Lincoln's murder by Booth's hands. But killing Lincoln was only part of Booth's plotting. Now he would have to evade capture as the first man to ever assassinate a U.S. president.
After this break, we'll follow the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth.
Now, back to the story.
The evening of April 14th, once word got out that President Lincoln had been shot, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton took over the investigation of the assassination. He employed his own military troops to investigate and later apprehend Booth.
Besides the investigation, that night Stanton also served as acting president, a position that he had no authority to hold. Stanton justified seizing the power on the grounds that Lincoln's assassination constituted a crisis, one that necessitated immediate and decisive action. He acted because he believed it was necessary for the stability of the United States as a whole.
However, Stanton's willingness and readiness to take over so soon after Booth's attack suggested that he may have known about or even participated in the conspiracy against Lincoln. It certainly appears that Stanton sought to seize power for himself in the confusion surrounding a presidential assassination.
However, this power grab may not have been out of character for Stanton. His life was marked with tragedy. When he was 13 years old, Stanton's father died, and he later lost his first wife and a baby in childbirth.
In 1860, President Buchanan appointed Stanton to the position of Secretary of War, a position he held throughout the Lincoln administration.
Like Vice President Andrew Johnson, Stanton was a devoted Democrat and had participated in numerous Democratic conventions prior to his appointment. Unlike Johnson, Stanton was deeply opposed to slavery and sought to punish the South thoroughly for their immorality, not only as slave owners, but as treasonous secessionists.
Stanton proved to be a controversial figure, often overstepping the powers of his position. According to Stanton, the Civil War represented a crisis point in United States history, and his means were justified by the needs of national stability.
He was known to be power-hungry, with a tendency to bend the law in order to suit his needs.
In the aftermath of Lincoln's shooting on April 14th, Stanton ordered all roads in and out of Washington to be closed, but the order came too late, as Booth had already escaped to Port Tobacco, Maryland.
Mere hours after Lincoln's assassination, Booth continued to a bridge on Soper's Hill, the point he and his conspirators had chosen to meet after their assassination attempts. Of all Booth's conspirators, only David Harold arrived. He and Powell had been separated after the failed attempt on Secretary of State Seward. After they met, Booth and Harold continued to Mary Surratt's tavern to gather guns and ammunition.
Well, meanwhile, the pain of Booth's broken leg proved to be an obstacle. In the immediate aftermath of Lincoln's murder, Booth operated under the power of adrenaline. Now, however, the pain became unbearable.
Horseback riding was out of the question. Booth and Harold realized that he needed immediate medical attention, and so sought the services of Dr. Samuel Mudd, who lived in Maryland.
Booth and Harold longed to flee to the relative safety of the southern states, but as more time passed, Booth's injured leg swelled even more and travel became impossible. Ultimately, he spent 5 days recuperating at Mudd's home.
Meanwhile, Stanton's investigation continued. He had identified John Wilkes Booth as the assassin mere hours after Booth shot Lincoln, and after searching Booth's rented rooms and questioning his known acquaintances, Stanton soon began to identify and arrest co-conspirators.
3 days after Lincoln's death, Stanton's investigators arrested the first of Booth's conspirators, Edmund Spangler, who had watched Booth's horse outside Ford's Theater.
A few hours later, more conspirators were identified and arrested. By the end of the day on April 17th, investigators identified Powell as Seward's would-be assassin and found him at Mary Surratt's tavern. Both Lewis Powell and Mary Surratt were arrested.
George Atzerodt wasn't arrested until April 19th. He'd raised suspicion by asking the bartender about the vice president's whereabouts on the night of the assassination, and searches of his rooms revealed his connection to Booth. He was the last of Booth's conspirators to be arrested, except for Booth and Harold, who are still recovering in Mudd's home.
By this time, Booth was one of the most wanted men in the United States, and he couldn't risk traveling by day. On the night of the 20th, just 6 days after Lincoln's assassination, Booth still suffered from his broken leg, but was unwilling to wait any longer. He and Harold left Mudd's home.
Booth's contact, Thomas Jones, ferried the pair across the Potomac River. Even in the formerly Confederate state of Virginia, however, Lincoln's killers weren't safe. Stanton's manhunt was growing closer with every day, and even with Southern allies, Booth and Harold couldn't escape justice.
Once across the Potomac, Booth and Harold met a farmer named Richard H. Garrett. They lied, pretending to be injured Confederate soldiers, and Garrett allowed the two men to rest and recover in his home.
When a tip reached Stanton that the assassin had crossed the Potomac, Stanton authorized a search party led by Colonel Conger to trail them into Virginia.
Meanwhile, Garrett's oldest son, Jack Garrett, grew increasingly suspicious of the so-called injured soldiers staying in their home. Jack asked Booth and Harold to move out of his home and into the barn in order to protect his father, and the pair obliged.
Conger's party now had multiple witnesses who were able to pinpoint Booth and Harold's location. On April 26, 1865, Conger met Jack Garrett, who led them straight to the barn where Booth was hiding. Conger's men surrounded the barn and demanded Booth surrender. Booth refused.
Harold stood near enough to the barn's entrance that investigators were able to seize and arrest him. Booth, however, was too far inside to reach safely.
Booth was armed, and investigators feared that following Booth into the barn would result in a dangerous firefight. Instead, they tried to negotiate with him to turn himself in. When Booth refused to surrender peacefully, his pursuers lit the barn on fire with Booth still inside.
In spite of orders to take Booth alive, one of Conger's men, Boston Corbett, fired on Booth. He claimed that he'd shot Booth out of fear that Booth was going to attack a member of his own regiment. He would later say, quote, "I waited till I was satisfied his purpose was to use his arms to try and fight his way out of the door that Harold had just been taken out of. I then fired on him. It seemed to me that God had directed it," end quote.
The wound would prove fatal, but not immediately. Investigators pulled Booth from the burning barn, but he was too injured for questioning. His last words were, quote, "Tell my mother I die for my country," end quote. No one could ever ask him if he was working under orders when he killed Lincoln.
The remainder of Booth's conspirators were arrested and tried. 4 would be sentenced to prison. Dr. Samuel Mudd, who had treated Booth's broken leg, and Edmund Spangler, who had watched Booth's horse, along with 2 other conspirators, Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Laughlin, who had helped plot Lincoln's kidnapping.
Another 4 were hanged in July, including David Harold, George Atzerodt, who had failed to kill Vice President Johnson, and Lewis Powell, who had attempted to murder Secretary of State Seward and injured many in his household.
The government also hanged Mary Surratt, the first woman ever executed in United States history. Her crime had been hosting the meetings between Booth and his conspirators in her tavern.
President Lincoln was a controversial figure when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, but he transformed into a beloved martyr and American hero overnight. In death, Lincoln was far more popular than he'd ever been in life.
If Booth's motivation, as some have speculated, was to inspire the South to rebel once more upon Lincoln's death, then his plan failed utterly.
In light of Lincoln's unpopularity prior to his death, we must ask if others besides Booth might have conspired to eliminate an incredibly powerful and widely distrusted leader. Factions in either the Confederate or Union governments may have allied with John Wilkes Booth in his assassination attempt.
That brings us to our conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theory number 1. Booth didn't act alone, but was working for the Confederate government, possibly even under the orders of their president, Jefferson Davis.
So soon after the end of the Civil War, Confederate loyalists would have been desperate to resist a Lincoln-led government. Given Booth's ties to the Confederate Secret Services, this one's a possibility.
Conspiracy theory number 2. Secretary of War Stanton aided Booth in the assassination or in his escape as part of an attempted coup.
Stanton's initial actions in the early hours after Booth shot Lincoln, closing the roads out of D.C. and publicly calling for Booth's arrest, were both too late to prevent Booth's escape. Stanton may have conspired with Booth, helping him escape and later ordering his troops to kill Booth before he could be questioned.
Conspiracy theory number 3. Vice President Andrew Johnson's lust for power, coupled with disagreements about governance style, led Johnson to eliminate Lincoln so that he could seize the presidency for himself.
In theory, Union leaders wanted Lincoln out of the way so that Andrew Johnson could take over.
And finally, our wild card theory. Booth faked his own death and lived under an assumed identity for decades after Lincoln's death.
President Lincoln left a lasting legacy on the U.S. In the words of President George W. Bush,
Lincoln's voice was silenced, but he, more than any other American, has spoken to all the ages, and his words have haunted and driven our history.
But is that history what we thought? Conspiracy theory number 1. John Wilkes Booth's Confederate Secret Service handlers ordered him to assassinate Lincoln. We know that Booth and his collaborators had already been recruited to kidnap President Lincoln. With the war going poorly for the South, Confederate President Jefferson Davis may have changed Booth's mission from a kidnapping to a murder.
Conspiracy theory number 2. Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, conspired with Booth to eliminate Lincoln. Stanton, who had a history of bending the rules to achieve his goals, oversaw the investigation after Lincoln's assassination, and he made several key decisions that allowed Booth to escape. Were those bad decisions an accident, or was he actually working to protect Booth?
Conspiracy theory number 3. Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, ordered Booth to kill Lincoln. Based on a near meeting between the two a few hours before the assassination, many speculate that Johnson and Booth may have been friendlier than the official record suggests. Additionally, Johnson benefited from Lincoln's death, as after the assassination he ascended to the presidency.
Finally, conspiracy theory number 4 is our most out there conspiracy, that Booth faked his own death with the assistance of either Stanton or Johnson. While this theory doesn't change the circumstances of Lincoln's assassination, it implies that officials in the U.S. government assisted Booth in his escape, which could implicate those officials in the assassination as well.
The most obvious of Lincoln's enemies were those who had, less than a week before his assassination, been at war on the side of the Confederacy. Even after General Lee's surrender, some Confederate troops planned to keep fighting, and the Confederate leadership still saw Lincoln as an enemy leader.
This brings us to conspiracy theory number 1. The President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, ordered Lincoln's assassination in order to destabilize the Union and win the Civil War.
While Jefferson Davis was never officially charged for any crimes related to secession or Lincoln's assassination, many in the Union still assumed he was guilty. Even before Booth was apprehended, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, had begun preparing a case to try to prove that Lincoln's death was the result of a Confederate plot.
On May 2, 1865, about 2 weeks after Lincoln's death, Andrew Johnson signed a presidential proclamation which read, quote, It appears from evidence in the Bureau of Military Justice that the atrocious murder of the late Abraham Lincoln and the attempted assassination of William H. Seward were incited, concerted, and procured by Jefferson Davis, end quote.
Davis had already fled the Confederate capital in early April, long before Lincoln was assassinated, and was currently in hiding. Johnson's government offered a $100,000 reward for Davis's capture. In 2018 money, that's more than $1.5 million.
During the case against Booth's conspirators, the Justice Department brought in several witnesses who testified that Davis had ordered the assassination or that he'd been actively involved with the plotting. Witnesses named Richard Montgomery and James Merritt testified that they were double agents who had infiltrated the Confederate Secret Service and had each personally seen Confederate leaders plan and authorize Lincoln's assassination.
But Montgomery and Merritt were proven to be perjurers before the case concluded, and no other concrete evidence was ever introduced during the trial.
In spite of their efforts, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and the Union prosecutors weren't able to prove any concrete connection between Confederate leaders and the assassination of Lincoln.
But whether they could prove it or not, there definitely was a connection between Jefferson Davis and John Wilkes Booth. As we discussed last week, Booth worked as an agent for the Confederate Secret Service. His initial mission, which he failed to achieve, was to kidnap Lincoln and hold him ransom to pressure General Ulysses S. Grant to trade high-ranking Confederate prisoners of war.
Jefferson Davis oversaw operations of the Secret Service, and he personally approved orders for his agents, including Booth, to attempt to kidnap Lincoln.
When Booth began plotting to kill Lincoln instead of kidnapping him, he conspired with the same men who had helped him plot Lincoln's kidnapping. Several people who sheltered Booth and helped him escape after the assassination were fellow Secret Service agents.
Davis might not have personally approved Booth's plan to assassinate Lincoln, but his Secret Service definitely gave him the resources he needed to do it.
In addition to his Secret Service work, Booth was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, a secret society dedicated to preserving the institution of slavery.
The Knights of the Golden Circle formed during the lead-up to the Civil War and may have been one of the earliest agitators for secession, a campaign that they ramped up after Abraham Lincoln's first-term victory. As they're a secret society, the Knights' specific activities can be difficult to discern, especially centuries after the fact. But we do know that they plan to conquer Mexico and parts of Central America and turn them into an independent slaveholding nation.
Besides John Wilkes Booth, other members of the Knights of the Golden Circle included his co-conspirators John Surratt and Michael O'Laughlin, as well as Confederate President Jefferson Davis.
We know Booth was working for Davis as a Secret Service agent, and we know that Booth and his accomplices shared a secret society membership with Davis, but we still can't say if Lincoln's death was on Davis's orders. Even if Davis did authorize Lincoln's assassination, Booth would have been an unusual choice for the job. He had no military training, and as a famous actor, he had a highly recognizable face.
On the other hand, as a well-known and respected actor, Booth had access to government elites that other Secret Service agents wouldn't have. Booth's ability to travel in distinguished circles served him well as a spy, and could also be valuable assets in an assassin.
Another aspect to explore is the timing of Lincoln's assassination. While the Civil War was still raging, Booth's kidnapping plot at least had a clear goal: prisoner exchanges, which had been halted by Union General Ulysses S. Grant. After the South's surrender, a kidnapped Lincoln no longer held the same tactical advantage, and a dead Lincoln would gain them nothing.
Except the Civil War didn't actually end with General Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Lee's army was only one of several Southern armies, and even after Davis received word of the surrender, he wanted to continue to fight. It's not unreasonable to think that Davis could have issued assassination orders as part of a last-ditch effort to destabilize the Union.
Besides the murder of Abraham Lincoln on the night of April 14, 1865, Booth also plotted 2 other attempted assassinations. Although the attempts failed, Booth's collaborators plotted to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson and the Secretary of State, William Seward.
As we discussed last week, Booth's collaborator Lewis Powell forced his way into the Secretary of State William Seward's home on April 14th, the same night that Booth shot Lincoln. Powell fought with Seward's house guests and ultimately stabbed 5 people, including his target, though all of those injured survived.
Another of Booth's conspirators, George Atzerodt, was tasked with assassinating the Vice President, Andrew Johnson. Atzerodt never made any attempt on Johnson, instead spending the night drinking in a bar.
If all of Booth's plotting had gone according to plan, not only would President Lincoln have died, but Vice President Johnson and the Secretary of State, William Seward, would also have been assassinated in a single night. This was no personal revenge mission. It looks like Booth was attempting to destabilize the entire United States government.
Lincoln was the first president to be assassinated, but not the first president to die in office. In the 25 years prior to Lincoln's assassination, 2 other presidents had died of natural causes while in office: William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor. By the time of Lincoln's death, the passage of power from president to vice president was hardly a potentially destabilizing action.
But to date, the president and vice president have never both died during the same term. Davis might have believed that a simultaneous attack on the president, vice president, and secretary of state would create just enough political confusion that the South might rise again and overtake the Union.
We do know of one other assassination attempt that Davis authorized at around the same time, and for exactly these reasons. On April 1st, 1865, 2 weeks before Lincoln's assassination, an explosives expert named Thomas Harney received orders from the Confederacy to blow up the White House with Lincoln and other government officials inside. Confederate leaders hoped this would destabilize the Union government and give the Confederacy more time to rally their forces.
John Wilkes Booth's co-conspirator, George Atzerodt, later confessed that he was aware of the plot, which suggests Booth was probably aware of it as well.
The plot to blow up the White House never materialized because Union soldiers captured Harney and his explosives team on April 10th, the day after Lee's surrender and 4 days before Booth shot Lincoln. While it's possible that in those 4 days Davis learned of Harney's failure and issued new orders to Booth, it's not likely, since such rapid correspondence was extremely difficult during the chaotic final days of the war.
The lack of concrete evidence connecting Davis to Lincoln's assassination is notable in light of how motivated prosecutors were to prove Davis guilty. The Union government didn't even have enough evidence to bring charges against Davis. They figured out about the kidnapping plot, but as for the assassination, that remained firmly in the realm of speculation.
Overall, I give this theory a 5 out of 10. Davis had a compelling motive to eliminate Lincoln, and the link between Booth's Secret Service activities and his assassination plot are powerful and compelling, so there's too much there to dismiss the theory out of hand. The missing piece lies in the lack of any physical evidence or credible witnesses to support the claims against Davis. Especially in light of the Union's aggressive investigation and attempted prosecution. If a smoking gun existed that could prove Davis was complicit, the prosecutors should have found it. The fact that no concrete evidence has ever been produced throws the entire theory into doubt.
We can't prove that the leaders of the Confederacy ordered Abraham Lincoln killed. However, Lincoln had many rivals, even within his administration. Lincoln may have been killed by someone he would otherwise consider an ally.
In 1937, a chemist named Otto Eisenschimmel published a book titled Why Was Lincoln Murdered? In the book, Eisenschimmel claimed to have exhaustively researched the details of Abraham Lincoln's 1865 assassination and came to the conclusion that John Wilkes Booth was operating under the instruction of someone close to Lincoln, his own Secretary of War.
This brings us to conspiracy theory number 2. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton collaborated with John Wilkes Booth to kill President Abraham Lincoln.
Stanton was definitely a controversial figure. Shortly after he was appointed, Stanton pushed for numerous new laws that would expand his position's power and legal authority. He also routinely violated the Constitution, including the prohibitions against habeas corpus, or holding a prisoner under arrest without charges or a trial.
Stanton claimed that he had the right to arrest anyone who, in his own words, quote, engaged by act, speech, or writing in discouraging volunteer enlistments or in any other disloyal practice against the United States, end quote. He arrested dozens of writers and newspaper editors who were critical of Lincoln without ever officially pressing charges against them.
According to Stanton, the Civil War represented a crisis point in United States history, and his means were justified by the need for national stability.
But Stanton's arrests and political maneuvering also showed a tendency to bend the law to suit his needs, a trait we would see again in the immediate aftermath of Lincoln's assassination.
Stanton's less than spotless reputation isn't the only reason conspiracy theorists are suspicious of him. Last week, we discussed how, on the night of the assassination, Lincoln was left unprotected in Ford's Theater after his bodyguard, John Parker, left his station. It was Stanton who hired Parker and assigned him to guard Lincoln that night.
Lincoln didn't trust Parker, and he specifically requested that Stanton assign a different, more trustworthy bodyguard that night, but Stanton refused.
According to Stanton, Lincoln's preferred bodyguard, Thomas Eckert, was unavailable that night. However, after Lincoln was shot and a messenger was dispatched to notify Eckert, the messenger found Eckert at home, doing nothing in particular.
And we should also mention another strange detail about Lincoln's night at the theater. Last week we explained that Lincoln initially invited General Ulysses S. Grant and his wife to attend the theater. When Grant canceled his plans, Lincoln invited General Henry Rathbone and his fiancée.
Like Lincoln, Grant had his own team of bodyguards. If Grant hadn't canceled his plans, he and Lincoln would have had 2 bodyguards present, and even after Parker abandoned his post, there still would have been 1 guard there to protect Lincoln.
We don't know why Grant canceled his plans with Lincoln that night, but we do know that, as Secretary of War, Stanton worked closely with both President Lincoln and General Grant. It's possible that Stanton encouraged Grant to skip the theater, knowing Grant's bodyguard's absence was necessary to his assassination plot.
It's possible, but it's entirely speculation.
Even more suspiciously, during Stanton's entire investigation, Lincoln's bodyguard Parker was never investigated or charged for abandoning his post and leaving the president unguarded. Perhaps Stanton himself had instructed Parker to leave his post and he was protecting his accomplice.
Or perhaps he thought the bodyguard was already suffering enough guilt for his fatal mistake, and there was no purpose in punishing him further. It's impossible to know Stanton's true motivations.
Hours after Lincoln was shot, Stanton met with witnesses from Ford's Theater to identify the assassin. Because John Wilkes Booth was so recognizable as an actor, witnesses were able to identify him almost immediately.
Booth's personal associations, fellow actors, and frequent theatergoers were all able to identify him. Corporal James Tanner took notes during Stanton's interrogations, and 2 days later wrote in a letter, quote, "In 15 minutes, I had testimony enough down to hang Wilkes Booth," end quote.
In spite of the ample evidence that Booth was the assassin, Stanton didn't publicly speak about Booth's identity until several hours later. Many newspaper printing presses began printing their early editions between 2 and 2:30 a.m., but Stanton didn't notify them of the assassin's identity until 3:20. Because of this delay, the New York Times, New York Tribune, New York Daily News, and New York Herald were unable to identify Booth in their earliest morning editions.
Outside the immediate area, the delay was even greater. New Orleans newspapers didn't receive Stanton's reports until April 19th, 5 days after the assassination. Virginia's Charleston Courier and Atlanta's Intelligencer received their earliest reports the day after that, April 20th.
In the aftermath of the shooting, finding and apprehending Booth should have been Stanton's #1 priority. Every minute counted if they were going to find him before he fled the area. But without a positive identification in the papers, the public had no way of knowing to watch for Booth. It's impossible to understand why he delayed for so long.
Once Stanton identified John Wilkes Booth as Lincoln's killer, he ordered that the military close all roads leading out of Washington, D.C. Every road and bridge was put under watch, except for one.
The only bridge that wasn't shut down, the one leading to Port Tobacco, Maryland, was the very bridge that John Wilkes Booth took to escape Washington, D.C. and evade capture. Conspiracy theorists see the open road as evidence that Stanton and Booth had previously agreed upon this escape route so that Booth could get away with his crime.
But the truth is, Stanton didn't intentionally leave the bridge open and unguarded. There was no telegraph station near the Port Tobacco, Maryland bridge, so Stanton was unable to notify anyone to close the road except by sending a messenger. Given the speed with which Booth fled Washington, D.C., he probably escaped the city roughly half an hour after he shot Lincoln, long before Stanton's messengers could arrive and close down the bridge.
But Booth couldn't stay ahead of his pursuers forever. 2 weeks after the assassination, Union troops, under Stanton's orders, finally cornered Booth inside a barn in Virginia.
Stanton ordered his troops to capture Booth alive for questioning. But in spite of these orders, a man named Boston Corbett shot Booth through the neck, killing him.
Corbett claimed that he'd fired on Booth out of fear that Booth was going to fire upon and injure one of his men. Eyewitness reports of what happened are inconsistent, but the barn's owner and his 12-year-old son both testified that Booth never raised his gun. 2 of the other soldiers also testified that Corbett snuck up behind Booth and shot him in the back of the head, which hardly sounds like self-defense.
What is clear is that Booth's death meant the Union troops could never question him to determine if he was a lone actor or working under orders.
If Stanton really did conspire with Booth to kill Lincoln, secretly ordering Corbett to silence Booth would ensure that Stanton's plot would never come to light.
After Booth was shot, the officers gathered his possessions, including an appointment book that Booth used as a diary. Initial reports suggested the diary was whole and intact, but a later examination found stubs, as if pages had been ripped out. Investigators ultimately determined that 18 pages had been removed from Booth's diary.
While it's possible that the original investigators simply didn't see the stubs, some have suggested that the diary was intact when Booth died, and the investigators removed pages that implicated Stanton in the assassination.
Whatever happened to those 18 pages, for over a century it looked like they were lost for good. That is, until 1975, when a Massachusetts man named Joseph Lynch claimed that Edwin Stanton's heirs had given him the deceased Secretary of War's effects, including the 18 missing pages from Booth's diary.
Lynch claimed these pages referred to a plot hatched between Booth and Stanton, alluding to but never explicitly describing plans to kill Lincoln.
2 years later, in 1977, the FBI opened a reinvestigation into the circumstances surrounding Lincoln's assassination. But when the investigators attempted to contact Lynch to examine his pages, he refused.
Not only did Lynch never turn over his diary pages to the FBI, he also refused to show the pages to the press. A movie studio called Sun Classic Pictures, interested in adapting a movie based on the missing pages, paid Lynch $39,000 for a transcript of the missing pages, but he still refused to show them the originals.
The only evidence that the pages even existed was Lynch's word.
After the FBI concluded its investigation with no new findings, 2 historians, Richard Sloan and James Hall, approached Lynch to review the transcripts of the diary pages for themselves. They found numerous discrepancies between the so-called diary entries and the facts that were known about Booth's life.
For example, The diary pages dated March 22, 1865, claimed Booth was in Washington, D.C. when he was known to be in New York during that time. Well-documented events were listed with the wrong dates and locations. Hall and Sloane's conclusion was that the diary entries were clearly a hoax.
As the actual diary pages are still missing to this day, we have no way of knowing what they said and if they actually implicated Stanton, or anyone else, for that matter.
Let's return to Stanton's investigation and the trial that followed. In 1865, 7 people identified as Booth's co-conspirators were arrested and stood trial. But at Stanton's urging, their trial would be non-traditional and, as some have claimed, unconstitutional.
Rather than giving Booth's conspirators a civilian jury of their peers, Stanton insisted on a military tribunal.
The very concept of a military tribunal wasn't introduced into the United States until the Civil War, and the new means of convicting criminals outside the traditional courtroom was highly controversial.
Stanton feared that civilians in the Union were likely to be Confederate sympathizers. Opinions about the Civil War weren't neatly split along North and South lines, and even one juror who was sympathetic to Booth's conspirators could be enough to keep them from a guilty verdict. A military courtroom full of soldiers who had fought and died for the Union granted him a greater likelihood of a guilty verdict.
A military tribunal also had fewer restrictions on how the prosecution could present evidence. A tribunal could also convene and reach a verdict far more quickly than a civilian trial, meaning the conspirators and their lawyers would have less time to prepare and mount a defense.
The accused weren't given a complete list of their charges until the night before their trial. One of Booth's conspirators, Edmund Spangler, didn't even secure counsel until the 3rd day of his trial. If Stanton had conspired against Lincoln, he ensured that his co-conspirators would not have the opportunity to produce any evidence identifying him as a co-conspirator.
The one aspect of this theory we haven't examined is the motive. According to this theory, Stanton orchestrated everything: Lincoln's assassination, Booth's escape and later death, and the trials of Booth's conspirators as part of a larger coup to take over the presidency.
At the time of Lincoln's assassination, the line of succession placed the Secretary of War 6th in line for the presidency, after the Vice President, Speaker of the House, President pro tempore of the Senate, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of the Treasury.
If Stanton was eliminating those ahead of him in the line of succession, he would have needed to order far more than the 3 assassinations Booth and his conspirators attempted the night of April 14th.
Unless Stanton simply wanted to eliminate Lincoln in favor of the more pliable Andrew Johnson.
But Johnson and Stanton were hardly allies. Stanton was so critical of Johnson's presidency, Johnson tried to have him fired in 1867. In response, Stanton's allies in Congress passed a law called the Tenure of Office Act, which prevented the president from removing Senate-appointed officials, like the Secretary of War, without Senate approval.
Johnson ignored the Tenure of Office Act and fired Stanton anyway, but he was shortly thereafter reappointed by Congress. Stanton then argued that Johnson had committed an impeachable offense in violating the act and pushed for an impeachment trial.
Ultimately, Johnson avoided impeachment by only 1 vote. Stanton resigned as Secretary of War shortly thereafter. If Stanton had thought a Johnson presidency would help him increase his own power, he was sorely mistaken.
The theory that Stanton was responsible for Lincoln's death originated from a single source: Otto Eisenschimmel's 1937 book, Why Was Lincoln Murdered?
Let's discuss Eisenschimmel for a moment. He was not a historian, but a chemist who treated conspiracy theorizing as a hobby and later as an income source. He rose to notoriety when his first book, Why Was Lincoln Murdered?, was published, but historians immediately panned it as mere fiction.
Ultimately, most of the so-called evidence that Stanton conspired against Lincoln is circumstantial. While he may have delayed in identifying Booth and violated the rights of Booth's conspirators, none of that proves Stanton conspired with Booth. He may have simply mishandled the investigation.
As for the missing pages in Booth's diary, we have no way of knowing what they said. They may not implicate Stanton or even have anything to do with Lincoln's assassination at all.
That said, not every one of Eisenschimmel's theories can be easily explained away. We still have no explanation for why Lincoln's preferred bodyguard, Eckert, was supposedly unavailable the night Lincoln was killed.
Then there's the fact that Stanton had unchecked ambition and disregard for his constitutional limitations, as evidenced by his regular abuses of power before and after Lincoln's assassination. It's not totally out of line to suggest he might have used murderous means to expand his own power. Overall, we give this theory a 6 out of 10.
One of the biggest factors that undermines the theory that Stanton plotted against Lincoln is the lack of motive. After Lincoln's death, Stanton held the same position for a short amount of time until he resigned during Johnson's administration. He didn't benefit at all from the assassination.
But there's another member of Lincoln's administration who had a clear motive to want Lincoln dead: Andrew Johnson. As vice president, he would inherit the presidency if Lincoln died, and the evidence connecting Johnson to Lincoln's murder is compelling.
On April 14, 1865, the night of Lincoln's assassination, Vice President Andrew Johnson was staying at a hotel called the Kirkwood House. That afternoon, he missed a visitor who left a calling card for the vice president.
The card read, "Don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home? J. Wilkes Booth."
More on this after a quick break. Now, back to the story. The day of Abraham Lincoln's assassination on April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth visited Andrew Johnson's hotel room. As Johnson wasn't in his room, Booth left his calling card. The card and the unknown purpose of Booth's visit are hotly debated among conspiracy theorists today.
This brings us to conspiracy theory number 3. Andrew Johnson had Lincoln eliminated so that he could seize the presidency for himself.
Lincoln and Johnson were rivals on the campaign trail. Lincoln was a Republican and Johnson a Democrat, and they ran together on a unity ticket in 1864 solely to appeal to a broader base.
Their relationship grew strained on the day of Lincoln's inauguration. Johnson was publicly drunk and, in Lincoln's opinion, made a fool of himself. From that point onward, Lincoln and Johnson's personal relationship was tense. It all boiled over when they disagreed about the best approach to Reconstruction. The arguments probably would have continued throughout Lincoln's term if he hadn't been assassinated just 4 months after his second inauguration.
Well, let's discuss the card Booth left for Johnson at the Kirkwood House. He left his card with the desk clerk, who in turn placed the card in Johnson's personal attendant's message box.
That personal attendant, William A. Browning, was an acquaintance of Booth's. The calling card wasn't specifically addressed to Johnson by name, and it's more likely than not that Booth's note was actually intended for Browning.
It's also possible that Booth came to the hotel to confirm that Johnson was still staying there, since Johnson was a target in the triple assassination plot. If that was the case, however, he wouldn't have had any reason to leave a calling card and arouse Johnson's suspicion.
There's no evidence that Booth and Johnson ever actually met in person. In fact, the only evidence of any connection between the two is the card.
Still, this visit and the note that Booth left behind made Mary Todd Lincoln a lifelong believer in Johnson's complicity in the assassination. We quoted her suspicions at the beginning of the episode.
She wasn't the only person who believed in Johnson's guilt. In the aftermath of Lincoln's death, some members of Congress weren't shy about expressing their suspicions.
On January 24, 1867, Missouri Representative Benjamin Lone openly accused Johnson of conspiring with the Confederacy to get rid of Lincoln. He said, quote, "An assassin's bullet wielded and directed by rebel hands and paid for by rebel gold made Andrew Johnson president. The price that he was to pay for his promotion was treachery." End quote.
That same year, a full congressional investigation was launched into Johnson's possible complicity in Lincoln's death.
The investigation searched for whatever evidence they could find, even offering amnesty to co-conspirators who could implicate Johnson.
But despite their best efforts, the investigation was unable to turn up a single piece of evidence beyond the card Booth had left for him. There's one more major hole in the theory that Johnson plotted to kill Lincoln. He was one of 3 men that Booth targeted for assassination on the night of April 14th.
While Johnson was a target, no attempt was ever made on his life. Johnson's would-be assassin, George Atzerodt, went to Johnson's hotel and drank at the bar, but never actually attempted to hurt or kill his target.
In theory, Booth could have known that Atzerodt would be unable or unwilling to follow through with his attack, and that Johnson was never in any real danger.
Or the assassination plot that never coalesced could have been a ploy to deflect suspicion away from Johnson. As a target of Booth's conspiracy, he couldn't be implicated.
However, if Booth wanted to deflect suspicion from Johnson, he wouldn't have left his card at his hotel.
In the end, regardless of whether or not Andrew Johnson conspired to eliminate Abraham Lincoln, he was very sympathetic to those who had conspired against Lincoln. In 1869, Johnson pardoned Booth's surviving conspirators, who had only served 4 years of their life sentences.
One of the conspirators, Michael O'Laughlin, died of yellow fever in prison before Johnson could pardon him. As for the other 3, Johnson argued that their sentences had been overly harsh and that they were not closely connected enough to the plot against Lincoln to deserve a lengthy prison term.
One of those men was Dr. Samuel Mudd, who treated Booth's broken leg and sheltered him for 5 days after the assassination. Other than treating his patient, Mudd was not involved in the plot against Lincoln.
Edmund Spangler, another of Booth's friends, had watched Booth's horse for him outside of Ford's Theater during the assassination. While Spangler wasn't aware of what Booth planned to do inside, his assistants ensured escape for Booth.
Finally, Samuel Arnold was a member of Booth's Secret Service cell and had been part of the plot to kidnap Lincoln, but he could not be connected to the assassination plot, and he wasn't even in Washington, D.C. on April 14th when Lincoln was killed.
The connections between these conspirators and Lincoln's death were tenuous at best. At least this was Johnson's claim when he pardoned Booth's conspirators. To others, though, his leniency was interpreted as a sign of his sympathy to the conspirators.
Additionally, Johnson was sympathetic to the Confederate States. Johnson was a Southerner and a former slave owner. His approach to post-war Reconstruction was to let bygones be bygones. He thought that enough damage had already been done to the South during the war, and post-war Reconstruction was the time to repair the damage, not to further penalize the rebels.
We should note that Lincoln also wanted to focus on unification over punishment and had expressed intentions to institute lenient Reconstruction policies. On this issue at least, Johnson and Lincoln had comparable goals, and killing Lincoln did not actually advance Johnson's agenda. Overall, there's little evidence to link Johnson to Lincoln's death. Even a congressional investigation couldn't build a compelling case against Johnson.
The only piece of real evidence is the calling card John Wilkes Booth left for Johnson the afternoon of the assassination. However, even that card has an alternate explanation, that Booth was calling not on Johnson, but on his friend who worked as his personal steward. Overall, I give this theory a 2 out of 10.
The theories we've discussed so far have focused on Lincoln's assassination and Booth's escape. The next theory is a change of pace, focusing more on the aftermath and on an alternate life story for John Wilkes Booth.
In 1907, a traveling carnival man named Finis L. Bates announced a new exhibit, a mummified corpse that he claimed belonged to the recently deceased John Wilkes Booth.
According to Bates, Booth was not actually shot to death in 1865. Instead, Union agents killed a look-alike, then covered up Booth's escape.
Our final and most out there conspiracy is generally treated as an extension of theories 2 or 3, but for the purposes of this episode, we're treating it as a theory of its own. Conspiracy theory number 4, John Wilkes Booth faked his death and lived for decades after Lincoln's assassination under an assumed name.
Last week, we talked about the official story of Booth's death. As a quick recap, after he killed Lincoln, Booth and his collaborator Harold fled into Virginia. They hid in Garrett's barn, and it was there that Union troops found Booth and Harold.
The troops were able to capture and release Harold, but feared to engage in a shootout with Booth. When Booth refused to surrender, the investigators lit the barn on fire. Then, in spite of explicit orders to take Booth alive for questioning, Boston Corbett shot Booth in the neck and killed him.
If Booth's death was faked and covered up, someone with authority over the Union troops must have overseen the plan. Either Edwin Stanton or Andrew Johnson would have had the power to order the troops to lie about who had actually died at Garrett's barn.
If either Johnson or Stanton did order Booth to kill Lincoln, they would want to ensure Booth could not be captured and questioned, exposing the treasonous alliance. Faking Booth's death would justify calling off the nationwide manhunt for Lincoln's killer.
According to Bates, after staging the events in Garrett's barn, John Wilkes Booth adopted a new identity as a merchant selling tobacco and whiskey. Finis Bates befriended John Wilkes Booth in his new identity, John St. Helen, and Booth eventually revealed his true identity to him. On the evening of January 13th, 1903, Booth drank poison, and he died the next morning. His suicide note included a will, but gave no reason for why he took his own life, nor did Bates speculate on the matter.
After Booth died, Bates acquired his corpse and featured it as an attraction at traveling carnivals. He also wrote a book detailing the secrets he'd learned about Booth's life, titled, quote, Escape and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth. He published the book in 1907, the same year he began exhibiting the body he claimed was Booth's.
In 1938, Bates allowed a Life magazine photographer to photograph the mummified body at an exhibit called Jay Gould's $1 Million Spectacle. Doctors and historians, comparing the body to Booth's medical records, had to confess that the mummy shared physical characteristics with the living Booth.
Specifically, the left leg was shorter than the right. The right thumb was permanently damaged after an old accident, and a scar on the neck matched Booth's.
In spite of the physical similarities between Bates' mummy and John Wilkes Booth, historians concluded that the body probably did not belong to Booth.
In recent years, Booth's descendants have offered to perform DNA tests on the mummy to confirm once and for all whether the corpse belonged to John Wilkes Booth. The mummy's current owners have declined all offers.
The major problem with this theory is, quite simply, there's little evidence to support it. None of the claims Bates made have been independently verified, and he had a financial incentive to make up sensational stories for the sake of book and ticket sales.
While the mummy shares some physical traits with Booth, its current owner's reluctance to perform a DNA test also suggests that they know the body doesn't belong to Booth. Or at the very least, they have their own serious doubts about its authenticity.
Overall, we give this theory a 1 out of 10. It's a fun bit of speculation, but not strong enough to be believed.
Even before his assassination, Abraham Lincoln's presidency was troubled, and the end of the Civil War was only the first step toward reuniting a deeply divided country.
Like the United States, Lincoln's administration was full of people who vehemently disagreed with Lincoln's policies and with one another. While differing political views don't always lead to murder, Lincoln's many rivals and enemies have provided conspiracy theorists with no shortage of potential conspirators for the past century and a half.
Now that Lincoln's assassination is so far in the past, and all the people involved long dead, it's unlikely we'll uncover any new evidence to definitively prove or disprove any theory.
Most of the theories about Lincoln's death involve coincidence and speculation, but very little concrete evidence. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the most likely explanation, and in this case, we have to come down on the side of the official story, that John Wilkes Booth decided on his own to assassinate Lincoln, and that his only conspirators have already been identified, arrested, and sentenced.